Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, listeners. This is Amit and Sam. Hey, Sam, how are you?
I'm very well, Amit. It's awesome to be back here recording our second podcast for our education audience. And it's been good spending some time with you around Asia Pacific too recently.
Excellent. It has been actually. And help us understand for the listeners who are new to this or are just joining us, what is this podcast all about?
Cool. So the focus for us is to have a fun, informative conversation on a regular basis around how technology is impacting in education. And we know this is a massive shift that's occurring in education globally. But certainly in our little patch of the world in Asia Pacific, we're seeing this take form in lots of different ways, right? And you and I have been in Thailand and Singapore and Indonesia over the last couple of weeks, and education and technology looks really different in each of those spaces, right? And so our goal on this podcast is to dive a bit deeper than just the surface and show how Microsoft technologies can really empower schools and students to achieve more.
Sounds good. So, sounds like a lot of fun. I'm definitely looking forward to it. I hope listeners find it useful. And for the listeners, please give us feedback in through the podcast tool that of your choice and let us know how what we can do to improve this. So let's get started.
Yeah, definitely. So, we spent some time in Indonesia last week together and just saw how they're starting to embrace online assessment and technology in their classrooms on a more regular basis. And Microsoft has a lot of tools that can support them in this space, right?
Absolutely. I think, one of my favorites that we've been talking to a lot of customers, especially in the area of computer based testing, is really Take a Test app. Take a Test app is really a feature of Windows 10 that has been available since 2016, where we've enabled schools to really put Windows and lock it down into a mode where students can take a formative test or even more high stake test by disabling all of the capabilities around copying and pasting, or even putting in USB devices into the computer and being able to use that as a means to copy or cheat during the test. So really locking it down and making it very easy to manage that environment. And we are seeing a lot of uptick in the interest around this, especially in Singapore and Indonesia. As you said, they have had to in the past create bespoke solutions, which meant a lot of cost, which has meant a lot of management overhead to just enable students to take tests on their existing machines. And
Yeah.
that's the key word here is existing machines. We're not expecting schools to have dedicated machines for testing purposes only.
Look, you're absolutely right. And I think you've called out just one of the many reasons why schools make decisions around technology choices for their students, right? And that's educational capabilities. And increasingly, as schools go towards computer based testing, and again, whether that's the informal end of the week quiz or whether that's a high stake external assessment, you need to lock that device down, schools are wanting that capability. And to take a test within Windows 10 is a great way of enabling schools to do that. I guess, some of the other factors there, always going to be price. Schools are always price sensitive, but, sometimes it comes down to form factor. And as we saw in Indonesia as well, actually sometimes laptops with battery power that will sustain, usage through a power outage, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that was a great example going to the school and seeing how they've deployed their existing desktop PCs, but and they only had one of the PCs that had UPS power where they were actually conducting the tests. However, if the power goes down, and it has happened in the past for the other PCs, unfortunately, the students have had to restart their test, which means that is productivity lost and also a lot of stress for the students. So having a device that could sustain itself through a power outage, for example, a all-day battery life in a low-cost device, and there are many to choose from our OEM partners, HP, Dell, Lenovo, as well as local ODM partners who are creating very low-cost devices that enable these modern scenarios for our schools to take advantage of.
Cool. So I think we could probably do a podcast on device choice all by itself, right? But that's not our focus today. We don't want to just touch on a couple of the things that we've seen in our travels recently. But I guess to foreshadow what's going to come, we want to do a bit of around the world in tech again and just show one or two things that have kind of surfaced on our radar before we do a bit of a deeper dive into our feature section today, which is going to be around Intune and device management. And I know a lot of our listeners are often IT administrators, or they have responsibilities for managing the technology in their schools. So I think they're going to get a lot of value out of our discussion around some tips and tricks and best practice when it comes to the thinking around why you even manage devices in the first place, and then what are the tool sets available from the Microsoft Education solution to enable them to do that. So introduction done, Amit. Let's dive into around the world of tech and back again.
Excellent. So, what's new in the space of edtech? Top of my mind, I've actually been doing a lot of research around the use of virtual reality and mixed reality in the space of learning. And I'm beginning to learn that, hey, I was actually very skeptical of this technology. But the more I read, the more I understand that, virtual reality, or what Microsoft calls mixed reality, is really actually enabling spatial learning, things that are very difficult to teach using two-dimensional objects like books and, in textbooks, or even on pictures, or even on a screen on a device. You really need an immersive environment to get some of these spatial information into the minds of our young learners. And that has actually proven to have had a significant impact on their ability to recall. So there are some studies that have been done recently that really have caught my eye, and I'll be sharing more links to that in our podcast at the bottom of this podcast link.
Yeah,
So
and I think that's a great one, right? Our listeners need to know, check the bottom of the podcast. Many of the things we're going to talk to today, we will link to, so you can go and do your own research and find out a bit more about this. But Amit, I want to ask you, our listeners may not be familiar with the distinction between virtual reality and mixed reality. Could you just give us a quick overview of that, please?
Sure. So the way I look at it and the way Microsoft really looks at it is that we are, talking about augmented reality, where we are augmenting a reality and virtual and physical together, and that's at one extreme of the, kind of example of how this technology is evolving. And a great example of that is Pokemon Go, very popular game that was available on phones where people were catching characters in the real world. Sorry, they were virtual characters, but they appeared in the real world through GPS locations.
Hugely popular, right?
Hugely popular. And I think that has a place as well in terms of learning, because it can give you more contextual information about a particular place, particular object that you're examining or learning about. I think that is a great example. For example, to be used in music, have a more experiential, kind of learning at the point of where that object is. The other extreme is virtual reality, which is more about having a very immersive virtual only experience typically using a headset that blocks out the real world. Now, what Microsoft is trying to do is think about technologies that will transcend between this virtual and immersive only world and the augmented, which is the physical and reality world, a physical and virtual world coming together, and put that all in a continuum. So we have a continuum from going from a virtual only world where I'm lost inside a headset because I'm having a very immersive learning experience, and bringing that into the physical world. So essentially what we are thinking of in the long term is being able to control the opacity or of the actual screen in front of you, so that you can toggle between having a fully immersive experience, which is virtual, or a virtual plus physical, which is the mixed reality aspect of it. So that's really how we are defining mixed reality.
And I guess, as always, Microsoft has a first party sort of solution here, and tools like the Microsoft HoloLens can kind of deliver that really premium experience. But we are starting to see partners develop their own headsets and their own solutions and software, of course, to work in that space as well, right? So the ecosystem is evolving quite rapidly.
Absolutely. And I think, this is something important for customers to understand and for listeners to really think about. Is Microsoft's really enabling a journey on this mixed reality route? It's not, yes, as you explained, we have the high-end capabilities with tools like the HoloLens. But we really start with the basics with any Windows 10 device, which is a modern Windows 10 device, right from the low end ones, have the mixed reality application or the mixed reality viewer application built right in. And if you want to know more, we'll be putting a link to the mixed reality viewer app at the bottom of this podcast as well. Go and check it out because that's really a great starting point to enable students to understand the application of mixed reality in the context of learning and how it enhances their capability. For example, we have a service called Remix 3D where we make available many different 3D models which we can import into tools like mixed reality viewer as well as Paint 3D, another application built right into Windows 10 that enables you to manipulate 3D objects and put those 3D objects into the real world and allows the student to take videos or photos alongside with the 3D object. And these 3D objects are not static, they can be animated as well.
And I think, to use the one example we looked at in Singapore last week together, right? The animation of the space station, right? You can place that right in the middle of your room. You can animate it so that the doors open out, you can spin it around, you can interact with it. Yes. And that's a hugely engaging learning experience for any students that are perhaps trying to contemplate what space looks like, but also maybe trying to understand things like scale, right? That they can suddenly have this experience of how these things align and what their relative sizes are, all through mixed reality in Windows 10.
Absolutely. And all you need to get started is a Windows 10 device that has a camera. Nothing special about the camera, just a standard camera that allows you to then bring these objects into these virtual objects really into a physical environment that the student's learning in.
Look, it's such an exciting area for education, this mixed reality, augmented reality, virtual reality, lots of application there. And I think we're going to see increasingly our partners develop exciting curriculum software and content for this. Just going to pivot the conversation a little bit towards something that I've been thinking about around the world of tech and back again, around a passwordless world. And I know passwords might be considered, boring and all the rest of it, but security is paramount, right? And see, at Microsoft, we have a huge focus on security, but increasingly schools need to as well, as they hold increasingly hypersensitive information around their students and around their staff, learning journey, their mental and physical well-being. The need for security is never going to go away, but happily, technology, we are starting to see increasingly easy ways to manage passwords. And biometric sign-in is something that I've been really interested in and exploring recently. And obviously, we have Windows Hello, right? And I reckon many of our listeners may not be familiar with Windows Hello, Amit. So I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you, what's Windows Hello?
This is actually very topical right now, Sam, and I'm going to take a minute here to just explain to you what I've been doing. So I've been working with a lot of schools here in Singapore, and they've done an initial study to understand the impact of biometric login. And Windows Hello, just to get it out, is really enabling use your face or your fingerprints or any other biometric mechanism or even other mechanisms to actually like bringing a device in proximity of your primary device can be used as Windows Hello. So Windows Hello is really a fast and intuitive way of minimizing the friction between you accessing the data and the information you need through a device. And the device could be a phone, it could be a laptop, it could be a desktop, it could be any, or even a 2-in-1 like a Surface Pro, really enabling you to, get productive really quickly. And in fact, when the recent study we've been doing here in Singapore has found that just by using technologies like Windows Hello has changed the school or the class start time from close to 13 minutes down to 2 minutes.
Oh.
I mean, just imagine this scenario where a student or 24 students come into a classroom, a teacher has to get the class started. Each of the devices is in various states. Either it's in standby or it's completely shut down. It needs to start up and then the student needs to authenticate. Now that process itself can be a minute to 2 minutes. And beyond that, the authentication, depending on whether a student has forgotten their password or not, will have impact on the actual class start time. Now what we're doing here is using Windows Hello to pre-register the student's fingerprint or their face with the device so that as soon as they start the device up, whether it's in standby or in complete shutdown mode, as soon as the device starts up, it recognizes the student based on their fingerprint or face using facial ID, which is enabled through Windows Hello enabled cameras on various education ready devices. And the authentication process is, literally immediate, and it's in seconds rather than minutes, and has actually had a material impact on the cost of password resets. And each password reset can be between $10 to $30 depending on your scenario, and that is a huge impact to your IT budget.
It's a really interesting play here, right? And we're seeing a number of third-party tools like, the Phaedo Keys as well, which allow biometric authentication. And, they're pretty affordable as a key, and it just increases that security. But, I wonder where else this could be used within the education system. And for me, two obvious choices or thoughts come out, and I haven't seen this yet, but I'm speculating. You could start to use Windows 10 Hello with maybe attendance register, right? That when that device is signed in with a facial recognition or a biometric thumbprint, that person is actually in your classroom. And if we took that a step further, what about that high stakes testing that we talked about at the beginning with Take a Test and other online applications, that you want to know that the person sitting at the computer is who should be taking the assessment. And tools like Windows 10 Hello could enable you to do that, right?
Absolutely. And the great thing with Windows Hello is it's not just about authenticating into Windows, but also authenticating into applications. And guess what? Even our browser, the Edge browser, now enables you to use Windows Hello authentication. So for example, your scenario of taking a test, if the test is to be conducted through an online portal, the online portal could request for a Windows Hello authentication. And that would make sure that the person giving the test is actually the person who's registered with their Face ID or their thumbprint. So also reduces any kind of leakage of test information here as well. So helps us be more compliant with our testing, helps us more productive in using the device for various scenarios.
Look, I would love to get a guest on our podcast, Amit, who could perhaps speak to this with even more authority than kind of what we're just touching on now, and kind of go a little bit deeper, because I just think authentication, security, multi-factor authentication, all of these things that Windows 10 and Office 365 enable, just a critical aspect and element of running a secure school. Not just the assessment side of things, but the attendance side of things, and just keeping the data that should be secure. If we take that to a faculty level and we think about some of the work that the HR or the finance team might be using, enabling that kind of combination of all of those security features within M365 really is critical. So maybe we should do a deep dive on that some other time.
So let us know, listeners, if you're interested to know more about this whole area of modern management, modern security, and enabling new scenarios through usage of these modern devices for education. So we'd be happy to hear, and then we'll respond to that. And I think that's a great idea, Sam.
Awesome. And I guess happily, that set us up really well for our feature section today, which is around easier device management, what the role of Microsoft Intune plays in this. And the starting question from a school IT perspective, or certainly maybe a school leader, I think our IT managers know why devices should be managed, but maybe a principal or a board of trustees is thinking, why should we even bother managing devices? We've paid this money for them unmanaged, surely why spend more time? When a school leader or someone asks you that question, why should we manage devices? What's your common response to that?
My common response to that is really flexibility in the way you want to deploy devices, purchase devices, and ultimately streamline the experience for the end user. The end user could be a teacher, it could be a student, it could be administrative staff in the back end of the school. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the person who is interacting with our systems has the optimal experience. And that means, from the time when you purchase the device, onboard it, and through the life cycle of that device, be it maintenance, security, hot fixes, right through the point where you're retiring that device. That's what we want to enable, that life cycle of the device in context of the user's scenarios that they use the device in.
Good answer. I think the flexibility is a key component of it. And Windows 10 is it's such a powerful system that it can run standalone, right? And we see that commonly. If someone goes and buys a computer for their home office or their home lounge or whatever it may be, and they just create a local user on the device, and Windows 10 will perform superbly. And that tends to be a bit of a single user type experience. And more commonly in schools, it's a multi-user scenario when it comes to students, isn't it? I mean, teachers in some countries are fortunate enough to have their own device issued to them. But equally, in many countries in our region in Asia Pacific, teachers must share devices as well, right? So this is where that managed experience really comes to its own. if you have a multi-user experience on the devices themselves.
Absolutely. I think, well, the pedigree of Windows has always been a multitasking, multi-user operating system. So enables really, the flexibility, like I said at the beginning. And let's just deep dive for a little bit on this whole concept of local users versus, in cloud users or
Sure.
directory-based users. I in fact just did a deployment recently at a school, and we did two scenarios. One was we got a BYOD device where we said, hey, go out to market and buy any consumer device and bring it into the school. And on the other end, we gave them a managed experience with a Windows 10 Pro device that was designed for education. So it in fact had Windows 10 Pro Education Edition. And I'll just describe the kind of difference in experience. The device that was purchased through the consumer channel, which was a BYOD scenario, came with Windows 10 Home.
Right.
And Windows 10 Home really gives you two options. One is to create a local user, as you mentioned, and that's a very device only experience. Or the other option is to create a Microsoft account. So typically a at Hotmail or at Outlook or at live.com user account, and you use that to log in into the device. The advantage with using the Microsoft account for this BYOD scenario would be you have control of the type of applications you install. Your settings would be made available on multiple devices. You would be able to access OneDrive to store your applications, OneDrive personal in this case, put in your data and make that available on multiple devices. On the other side, we had the Windows 10 Pro device, the Windows 10 Pro education device, which allows you to really, at the point of installation, it gives you a choice. It asks you whether this device is a personal device or if it's a work or school device. And depending on how you answer that question, it's going to give you the ability to manage it in the way you want.
Yeah. I'm going to jump in there, Amit, because I know exactly what you're saying. And I did the same thing with a school recently, and they didn't get that choice, even though they were running Windows 10 Pro Education, as you described. Yeah. And the reason was their device wasn't connected to the internet. Okay. And so that device must be connected to the internet during that setup stage, right? Or else you're not offered that option.
Absolutely.
So if you're a listener and you're wondering, I don't see that option, make sure your device is connected to the internet when you're doing this.
Yeah, so absolutely. That's a great point. So again, this comes down to where is your identity being stored, whether it's local or it's in the cloud or on a directory. Obviously, as we move forward, more and more services are going to be cloud only. So we do encourage our school systems to think about the implications of using cloud in a safe, secure, meaningful way for your education needs. And we would be happy to, have another podcast on security and policy around the usage of cloud, but that's a different topic altogether. But you're absolutely right. Windows 10 Pro does need you to be connected to the net before it gives you the choice of being able to choose whether it's a personal device or a work device, work or school device. As soon as you choose the work or school device option, it lets you connect your device to Azure Active Directory, which is what powers Office 365. And just for the listeners who are new to our podcast, let them know that Office 365 for Education is a free offering online. It's a free offering as long as you want to use the services online. We'd be, again, happy to give a link to in the podcast to Office 365 Education plans and talk about the difference between the free and the paid plans. But essentially, from a device perspective, all you need is Office 365 A1 for you to be able to join the device into Azure Active Directory and get your authentication done from there. Now, additional to Office 365 A1, we have the choice of having Intune for Education, which is really a cloud-based mobile device management tool that allows you to then manage your Windows 10 Home or Windows 10 Pro device from remote cloud service, which enables you to then deploy applications and settings that are relevant for your students or educators in the context of their daily usage scenarios.
I think that's a great point you've just pulled out there, Amit. And this is this idea that with a mobile device management, when you go into managing devices, there's sort of two levels that some of that management can operate at. One is the device management, those settings or those policies that you want to control or restrict. So a really simple example, do you want the students or the teachers to be able to use the camera on the device itself? That's a Windows 10 setting that most MDM, including Intune for Education that you've just mentioned, enable an administrator to be able to turn that on and off remotely. But then the second layer of management is those applications. Which apps do you want to appear on the device? And actually, which users do you want to be able to see those apps on that device? And this is the beauty, I guess, of managed devices, that a school as an organization has complete control over that two levels of management of their devices, right?
Absolutely. I think, it lets you really manage, the way you want it to be because, and gives you the flexibility to lock down as many of the settings as you want or keep them open so that the user has a level of freedom as well on that device. So it's entirely up to your policy. I think this is where, the technology has to marry up with your policy and the usage scenarios that you're enabling for your students and educators.
You touched on the fact that Intune for Education comes as part of some of those paid offerings in Office 365. And the big difference, and this is the trend we're seeing, and so much of technology now is going towards cloud managed devices, isn't it? So you have this option for, I guess, modern management out of the cloud. And then there is still that traditional or that legacy management of devices, which is often managed by, a local domain controller using group policy on those devices. And I'm sure many of our listeners today will be very familiar with group policy for locking down devices.
And I think, just one more point, while we might have listeners who are very much aligned with the Microsoft Windows devices, I also want to, call out here, and probably a good point to do so before we lose all our customers and listeners who have non-Windows devices. So tell me more. Have you seen Intune manage other devices?
Totally. And I think this is the exciting thing, is that Intune offers up this sort of single pane of glass when it comes to the management of operating systems in your organization. Now, of course, Windows and Windows 10 is managed superbly through Intune. Some of the other operating systems that you can manage through Intune include Apple's macOS as well as Android. And so it pretty much covers most of the use case scenarios that I see in education, both K-12, but also higher education. And sometimes schools are giving their senior leadership teams a smartphone to enable them to be contacted, outside of hours or to kind of keep working on the go, and having the ability to take the centralized policy that's defined in something like Intune and roll that out and manage that across smart devices as well that are issued to teachers, be that phones or tablet, is a tremendous kind of win for the IT person, because every IT team I've ever been a part of or worked with have been looking for that elusive kind of single pane of glass that gives them that complete visibility across all devices and across their network as well. I think the other thing that's worth pointing out at this stage is for many of our listeners who may be going, okay, great, I've got local domain controllers with group policy, I'm interested in exploring cloud more to manage these. I want to look at Intune or Intune for Education. How do I kind of marry up my existing policy with cloud policy? Then we've got a great tool, which we'll put in the link to the podcast as well, called MMAT, which is MDM Migration Analysis Tool. And what this will do is actually look through your existing, some PowerShell, and it will look through your existing group policy, and it will try to match that with the equivalent CSP in Intune to show you what is a straight translation in terms of your policy into settings. And also where there might be gaps, which enables an IT administrator to try to figure out how else they might manage devices and settings through using that. So the tool is MMAT. It's on GitHub, which exciting news as well, has joined the Microsoft family recently. And you can download that free to run that to see how quickly and easily you might be able to migrate your policy to using a cloud MDM such as Intune. What do you think about that, Amit?
No, I absolutely love that idea of being able to manage multiple devices from this single pane of glass. It's been a pain point for so many customers for so long. So I think anything we can do here is going to be a positive. So yeah, I think we've covered a lot around Intune and the way we are managing devices. What else have we got for our listeners today?
Well, before we just round that out, I do want to just touch on the last couple of things here, which is really what version of Windows do we really need if we want to go managed in a school's environment? Because you and I both know we kind of live in this echo chamber a little bit of, we're so ingrained in this, right? But many of our listeners won't be that familiar with the different versions of Windows. What do they need to be able to manage a device effectively in their school?
Yeah, so earlier in the podcast, we talked a little bit about Windows 10 Home and Windows 10 Pro and Windows 10 Pro Education. It does cause a lot of confusion in our customer base in terms of, hey, which device do I buy and which is the right edition of Windows? And I think the answer comes down to how are you, purchasing the device? How are you actually managing the device? And how do you actually deploy it and continue to manage it while the device is in your institution? And how do you retire it? So the answer to that is much easier now with Windows 10 than it was in Windows 8 or Windows 7. For example, when you bought a Windows 7 Home Edition or Windows 7 Pro Edition, to upgrade it from Windows 7 Pro to Windows 7 Enterprise or any other higher edition, you would have to essentially wipe and reload the operating system, which was a lot of work. Whereas now with Windows 10 Home and Windows 10 Pro, you can upgrade editions by purely changing the product. Let me kind of take a minute to explain how that works. Every version of Windows that's installed on a device is actually capable of being upgraded in place
Right.
rather than having to do format fdisk, if those things mean anything to you. That was a painful world that a lot of customers have had to live with in the past, especially with Windows 7. But now with the modern deployment, all you really need to do is change the product key and it will enable the new functionality in the edition that you're upgrading to. And when you're done with being at the institution and you've managed and you want to retire the device, you can simply change the product key back and it'll revert back to the original version of Windows without having to reinstall or do any kind of downgrade actions on the device. So it's all of this upgrade and downgrade of the editions of Windows is controlled by the product key. So product key really is, as the name suggests, is the key to enabling or disabling the feature sets that are enabled by various editions of Windows 10.
Perfect. So the take-home message here is really to get the most around management, you should probably be starting at Windows 10 Pro. And if you've got specific requirements, you may need to jump up to Windows 10 Enterprise, Windows 10 Education to maximize the hooks that you can do around management. But Pro's the starting place.
Yes, our recommendation, even if you're doing a BYOD program, is to look at Pro. And the other reason for Pro is not, apart from the operating system capabilities, is also the typical device specs that you get with Pro are much more aligned with the education requirements, especially devices that have commercial warranty, have commercial support, so that they can actually have on-premise repairs rather than having to return to base repairs. So those sort of things change the total cost of ownership. So it's not just about the operating system capabilities, but device capability and the services that go around with that device. So Pro is a great starting point for all of those reasons.
Great considerations to share with our listeners, Amit. Thank you for that. And look, as we head into the final minute or two of our podcast today, we usually look to finish off with just a couple of tips and tricks, or maybe a next big thing that we're aware of. And I'm going to come in with one of my favorite tricks around Intune for Education. And that essentially is this ability to do remote wipe and remote reboot. So from the browser interface of Intune for Education, you can happily see any device in your organization that is joined by Azure AD and enrolled into Intune for Education. And you can get a bit of a health report on that. And you might have a teacher who's called you from the far side of the campus and they say, hey, having some issues with device X. And you can actually look at that through Intune for Education, and you can initiate a remote reboot of that device to see if that might be all that's required to fix it. And if not, you can actually also issue a remote reset of that device. So you can actually then go through the very simple set up again process that we described earlier when it came to managing devices. So that's my tip and trick inside Intune for Education, remote wipe, remote reboot. Have you got something to share with us as we close off today, Amit?
Absolutely. My new favorite shortcut in Windows is in Edge browser, in fact, is Control Shift and R. That's Control Shift and R. That actually, so if you're on a website and you see an icon in your address bar that looks like a book, and Edge has a little icon that looks like a book, that actually, when it lights up, it indicates that the website or that web page is really ready to be viewed in reading mode. So if you press Control Shift R or click on that icon itself of the book, you will actually notice that Edge makes it much easier for you to read that particular page. And part of this new reading mode is also what we call immersive reader, which really enables you to even get Edge to read the page out to you. So there's a voice that you can program to read it out aloud. You can change the text options. You can make the background black, blue, and many other colors. And there are learning tools built in. So it enables you to turn things on like grammar tools to highlight nouns, verbs, adjectives, be able to break down words into syllables, and also do things like, highlight line by line reading, paragraph reading, or even 5 lines on a page kind of reading. So it really changes the way you are consuming content on the internet. So my favorite feature, the reading mode in Edge browser. And we'll put
Nice
a
one.
link out for that as well in the podcast as to how listeners can take full advantage of that capability.
Yeah, good call out. And look, I think the whole accessibility angle around Windows 10 and Office 365 is, again, maybe that's a future podcast for us to go a bit deeper in that. And again, maybe we try to pull in somebody else who's an expert internally on that just to kind of share some of the knowledge there. But again, listeners, you tell us in the bottom of the podcast if there's something you want to hear, let us know so that we can focus on that for future sessions. And I think with that, Mr. Pawar, we are pretty much done for today's session.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's always a pleasure. I know you're based in New Zealand. I'm based in Singapore, so we get different perspectives. So I'm really happy to share them. And hopefully, our listeners are enjoying what we're doing here. Let us know. And we look forward to our next podcast coming up soon. Thanks for
And
listening.
thanks for listening, guys. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.